additional. Some member states are very sensitive for that. So then, during 4 years, we can have 800 billion additional funds devoted to defense. If to calculate from another angle, we can calculate how much of money then European Union will spend in general for defense. So because we need to not to forget that now member states are spending around of 2%, 1.9. So if we are adding everything, so we shall have that around of 600 billion for defense will be spent annually, and 2.4 trillion will be spent for defense during the next 4 years. Since member states, if you look into statistics, in average are spending around of 30% of what they're spending for defense, for investment into defense, for procurement of weapons, so we can very easily to calculate that around of 800 billion real money can go into investment, into procurement of weapons, into industries. The question is, into which industries? Because again, from Draghi report that till now we were procuring not so big part of our weapons from European industries. We were, spending our money outside of European industries, from third countries, mainly from United States, which is, I am not military guy. I am a civilian from all the background. I came into politics from physics. But I'm always saying that, in my view, when we're talking about defense industry, we need to understand that defense industry is not just another industry, like automotive or chemical industry. From my point of view, defense industry is one of the very important defense resources. Because if really we shall face real aggression, real war, then for us it would be very important to have on European soil, not far away from possible conflict in our zone, our industry able to maintain, to produce new things, and so on and so on. So that's why investment into European defense industry is one of the crucial tasks which we are speaking about. Yes. To invest more, to invest better.
So this afternoon we are going to talk about academia, research, cooperation through 3 presentations that will be made. Each presentation will be about a quarter of an hour, and then we'll have a 5-minute slot for discussing, raising questions, and so on and so forth. The title of the first presentation is Zoom In, using bricolage to spread terror, and the paper is by Julie Wade, Christine Dugron-Clément, and Michael Dinger. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, we need the mic.
Where's the clicker? Is it this?
Yes, it is. Just click.
Oh, there it is.
Yes.
Okay, so we're talking about, we're interested in how the Islamic State use social media to inform their messaging. Our timeline for this, just to give you kind of a point of reference, is we're kind of more towards the peak or the ceiling, at least territorially, of their power. So this is kind of a 2015 era. Anyways, they continue to be an ongoing threat, and of course we're interested in how the internet and social media can be used for kind of terroristic organizations and these kind of non-traditional organizations in terms of the reasoning they have for messaging, the intentions behind the social media, and we'll see in a second when we get to the methodology kind of how the social media and interaction over social media informs their messaging in other formats. So we're interested kind of in this interaction between social media and their digital magazines that they actually produce in order to reach their kind of target audience. In terms of goals, the kind of outcomes and intentions they have are interesting because there's multiple points behind the messaging of they're trying to gain recruits, so they're trying to get people to come and join the cause. They're also trying to essentially establish identity in terms of so to speak, branding themselves. And then we'll also see that there's an intention to create legitimacy as a state, when we get a little further into our kind of timeline here. Okay, let me go forward, and I'll let you talk about bricolage.
Okay, so the theory that informs much of this work is the theory of bricolage, which has been around since the 1960s or so by the French anthropologist Levi Strauss. And so it's basically this idea of taking something out of nothing. And so traditionally it was looking at lower income communities and looking at how are scarce resources used in a new or innovative way. But nowadays we typically see it in operations management, project management, and so it might be taking existing machinery and just using it in a creative or just a different way than initially intended. So in this purpose that we're looking at using social media. We're looking at using Western tools and using it in an innovative way to create legitimacy for a movement, which is, I think, really interesting because it's trying to skirt the rules of the social media, right? It's trying to use privacy settings to get across messages of violence and terror. And so it's getting around these rules, but at the same time, it's trying to create legitimacy in essentially Western tools. And so it's kind of this interesting tension that emerges.
So, that's very strong. Okay. I'm going to be quite quiet, promise. So concerning the methodology and the corpus analyzed, as you can imagine, this is a kind of subject that it's not in open data for lots of them, and especially because after the rise and the collapse of the Islamic State, a lot of the data that were previously available online concerning their activity in social networks have been withdrawn for security and defense purpose. So what we've done, we've made a first pass in encoding their main magazine, namely Dabiq and Dar al-Islam. We also had access to an interview with expert and specialized due to our knowledge of the topics and the collaborations that we were leading with them. And we were also making like analyzing of what we had saved of the accounts, supporters on social networks, and also of the audio speeches of the leaders that have been, lots of them have been done, and especially during the rise. We chose to work on two different slots of time because they were quite representative. The first one, as you can see, is between September to December 2014. Why is it choice? It's just after that the Islamic State declared the real existence of the caliphate. So we are at a full rise, and they were going from victory and victory, gaining territories. And the second part was February to May. It is the time where they had like a kind of hot topic. Maybe some of you remind of Jordanian pilots who have been slaughtered online. It is at this period of time. And we observed that they were in a kind of window sailing concerning the gain on territories. So it was interesting for us because it was a twist and a change in their strategy and in the narratives that they were using. So I'm going to show you the result of the synthesis of all of the things. If we are going in October, oh yeah, I didn't emphasize, sorry for that guys, that we used like English medias and also French medias in order to see if they were a correlation or if they were leading in a different way. So what we observed, we make like a strong encoding with the themes that were aboard in order that were spoken about, in order to see if they were connected with the topics online that were used on the social networks, no matter if it was for the pro or the cons. The idea was to see if ever they were using like kind of hot topics, kind of trend marks, in order to include it in their own communication. If you are going into October, as said, it is a beginning of the official rise. You've got like major themes like guidance for the fighters, of course the enemies, a lot of big parts was dealing and was talking about the enemy, and no surprise, the Islamic State and the Caliphate is presented like a real structured state with a complete governance and also in capacity to compete with other states, including for their partisans and for enhancing people to come and settle in. And the Hijra and the Jihad were a part, as well as at the very beginning, to what we called export of conflict, meaning leading terrorist attack or this kind of thing. It's a kind of exportation of the conflict, meaning not on the territories that were occupied and detained by the Islamic State. What you can have is like an extract of one of the things that we can have. Interesting thing, the Islamic State knew since the beginning that they were going to be a subject of study, and they declared, we don't want to be a subject of study. So they already know that they were going to be this kind of interests. If we are going to November and December, we observed that some main items are still deployed into this communication, and we observe kind of new subtopics, and one of the first subtopics is the first mention of the lion cubs of the Caliphate, namely of the kids, I know that some of you knows, of the kids that were trained in order to become soldiers, and also with pictures with kids that slaughtered prisoners and this kind of thing. It is the first moment that we can see the thing. And in December, we had also the rise, I put you some examples, explaining that the Caliphate and the Islamic State is starting to mine his own currency, and it reinforced all the rhetoric concerning the state, the legitimacy of the state, and that the way they are leading these kind of things. We are going now on the second period of time. We had like a highlight on different items, strengthening the state of structure of the Islamic State, which is no surprise because, as said, they were facing a kind of counter-attack, and they were banging on this kind of window sailing, as I said, comparing to the former period where they were grabbing territories and gaining victories to victories. And they also emphasize that it is the only way that you can live in accordance with the principle of morality of Islam. So you've got a duality like morality towards immorality of Westerners, and more widely of their enemies and opponents. If you can go. In March, we see that they go on main themes, but we are no such an appearance of sub-items. And that led me to the next slide, please. You are doing that so well. So in April, as said, main themes still going on, but other items appears, or at least they were not receiving the same attention and the same treatment, and I am thinking to the women topics. And that is definitely interesting because you see that you are like not succeeding and you are finding other ways. And this is definitely very interesting concerning what we have observed on the social networks. As you see, it is the curve of the apparition and the evolution of the sub-temperaments. What we've observed, which is not here, it's a correlation in between the English and the French version, knowing that the French was sticking at the English one and sometimes with a kind of delay into the translation. What is interesting and what we observed after the analysis of the interview of the expert as well as of the hot topic on the social networks, it is that they include the topics into their own communication with a kind of a slot of time from 2 to 3 months. Not easy to say it. When I told you about like morality and women, do you remember the Yazidi woman? It is just after the Yazidi woman, and all the community, even the Westerner, were very touched by the history of the Yazidi woman. And just after, they creating their own topics on women. So definitely they were surfing on the hot topics, no matter if they were from their partisan or from their enemy, fighter, and opponents, in order to reinduce it.
So basically, what we're kind of seeing here is this iteration, so to speak, between the social media and the digital magazines, where I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it's unclear if they were intentionally creating the hot topics or like trying these out so much as they were using them as like seeing what was happening and then turning it into content because they knew it was happening. So there was roughly, as you see at the bottom here, like a 1 to 3 month delay between something trending on social media and then it would appear in the digital magazines. In terms of causes, I think there's kind of this interesting problem that they had as kind of this, terroristic organization of, in terms of human resources, you can't exactly go out and, hire on the open market for people to, manage your social media and manage your messaging. So you have to essentially work with what you have in terms of the expertise available to you for people that, kind of believe in your cause and join your cause. And there's this kind of implication likely that we've inferred that it seems likely that newer recruits are more likely to be younger digital natives, people that grew up with social media, people that are familiar with this content and how it works online. But also that there's not necessarily this hierarchical relationship. It kind of implies like a decentralization to the process here where people that were more likely to be decision makers are kind of deferring to people that have better expertise or more familiarity in terms of social media and messaging with this generation. In terms of implications, there's kind of a broad implication that, the messaging that appears on social media will end up appearing in kind of these more legitimized, Islamic State communications. And it's almost, you can perhaps to an extent, even though things have likely evolved since 2014-15, potentially predict to a sense, the kinds of things that are likely to appear in their content, their communications. We suggest that potentially kind of more modern technologies could engage with this on the problem-solving side, but as we continually see in this space, kind of the aggressors, the other side is also probably taking advantage of the advances and likely probably even more sophisticated in terms of piecing things together through this bricolage format that we talk about and leveraging social media and then feeding into large language models and generative AI in order to create communications and make sense of it. And then we kind of have like a broad policy kind of question, policy kind of implication of to what extent can filtering and or censoring these things. So if you can identify the messaging and try to head things off, who's going to make the decision in terms of what can be filtered out, what can be censored out. And as we saw, they managed their social media in kind of a very clever way in terms of, keeping things small, keeping the account small to where they weren't really registering in terms of catching through Twitter. And, there were, I think, like max of like 1,000 followers, if I remember right, on these accounts. So that if any given one was shut down, it didn't exactly collapse the whole, social media messaging system because they were kind of smaller cells of messaging. So to what extent can we use, interventions to identify and head off these problems is kind of a broad implication of the work here. And I think that's all we have in terms of scheduled discussion. But I'll defer to you for questions.
Thank you.
Perfect timing, thank you. And I think we already have a question here.
Hello, thank you. I have two questions. Either one of you could answer, but I think they're from the part where the gentleman spoke. At some point you said they defer, yes, senior decision makers may be deferring to younger generations on digital messaging. And you said the younger generations are experts. What do you mean exactly by deferring? What is the exact meaning of that? And then you also talked about social media and you said they have smaller cells through which they communicate. and it's not the end of the world if one account gets closed. But then my question would be, how do they achieve efficiency or effectiveness if they have small accounts?
Okay, many things. We talk about like new recruits that were digital natives and that were skilled because they recruit some of those kind of profiles. So you had like, and even the guys who were very good in communication had a special status into the Islamic State. And it was more or less, you can compare this kind of status to the one of the fighters. And during a period of time, everybody could like send a message on the social networks, and after they try to rearrange and to gather it in order to add like a kind of control on the communications. But to a certain extent, they can use this kind of thing. Another thing that they used, they were making like contests for the best story, meaning that people, and especially fighters, but not only, can post online like pictures, videos, or photos, and the best stories making the most views, the most following, the most reaction, was then published into the official communication like a kind of reward. So you had like a kind of evaluation depending of how many people have seen what have been published and else. But the thing is, if you are dealing with the magazines that we make, the encoding, of course, you could access to this if you are looking for, but it was mainly for the partisans. And the thing is, they try to reinforce their base, their partisans, or the people that they want them to be joined by using this thing in twisting what was into the Western medias. So you had this different thing, and after they create ACMAT, which was a communication cell in order to manage and to organize. But at the very beginning, and we see, and that's why we are talking about bricolage, because at the very beginning, you see people who are creating their own process due to the context, due to the evolution, and at the very beginning, even after, people had a kind of freedom about posting, and what have been efficient have been then included in a global process. I don't know if that's clear, I've answered.
Yeah, just a follow-up question quickly. If they control communications, it's fine, I can speak without the microphone. If they control communications, it means they have somebody strategizing behind.
It's the agents of communication that have been created just after. But it was not at the very beginning, after they want to like trying to add a gatherization and kind of control, and especially for this kind of publication. That's why for us it was very interesting to add something which was definitely very managed and produced by a dedicated agency, and to see how it was fed by the other inputs that they could have, like the, as said, the fighters' publication and the reaction of the social networks. And the interesting thing is, it seems that if ever you are looking what are the hot topics on their subjects, no matter if it's pro or con, you can have an idea of the declination of their own strategy. So they are not only reacting, they were also twisting the reaction in order, like when you are doing judo, I don't know if some of you are familiar, but the idea is to use the strength of the opponent. So they were using the strength of, let's say, the hot topics in order to use them for their own benefits.
Any other question? Maybe I have a very small question. You mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that your subjects, the subject of your study, knew that they were observed. How much do you think that this had an influence on their behavior and on the observations you made during the study?
That is always a question. Does the behavior of the particle change when she knows she is observed? Quantum physics. But the thing is, in the first magazine, they said, we know that all eyes are on us. We don't want to be a subject. And they were standing that because we are more than a subject. We are like a real state. We are like the caliphate. We were where the real Muslim can live their faith freely. Basically, it was mainly that. They were facing a huge coalition So they knew that they were going to be observed. A part of their communication was made for us, not all, but a part. So of course it will change the narratives, or some narratives and some strategic narratives that could have been shared by the agency, and I'm on it. But the thing is, at the end, finally, they try to find what fits them the more.
Okay. So thank you for the answers and presentation.
Thanks for your attention.
And the second talk will be by Elizabeth Shepard-Selam. And the title of the presentation is The Digital Battleground, Social Media as a Tool of Modern Warfare and Threats to the West.
On fait comme avec les collègues? Comme ça?
C'est-à-dire,
Non, je sais pas, il faut se mettre là. Okay.
alors vous êtes assez libre, il y a un micro ici, vous pouvez vous mettre au
Je vais
pupitre,
peut-être me mettre
sinon,
au pupitre,
comme
ça
vous
va être
le
plus
sentez.
facile de regarder les gens.
Un quart d'heure.
Okay. So, this actually is a good next step after what the colleagues just talked about. This study actually goes from the period that we just talked about to now. So I'm looking at, and you can actually go to the next slide, please. Ah, c'est moi. Comme ça? On va y arriver, hein? Ah, voilà. So I'm looking at, in this case, at the rise of social media as a battleground for terrorism and extremism. Much like the colleagues that just spoke, I look myself at quite a bit at the Islamic State. But I look as well now at a comparison with the extreme right, and comparing in particular the strategies, some of which you talked about. Now, I'm a political scientist and I don't use numbers and coding the way my colleagues did, but we'll talk a little bit about the methodology. But the idea is to look at over the past decade, and looking from the period that we just looked at, 2015, at the highlight, sort of at the high point of when the Islamic State has a physical territory, the caliphate, but also up to today, because we see some same trends. And someone in the last presentation sort of asked that question: how are they doing it today? We still see a way of trying to hold on to their public and still scare us. They do actually still address quite a bit of their information to us to scare us. So looking at both types of these groups and their use of digital platforms, both for propaganda, recruiting, and coordination, as well as, I mean, we won't get into it here, but sort of getting money, donations, and even tech sometimes suggestions for their public. And we're also, and this research that I've been doing for the last 10 years also looks at a lot of the security implications, and also at the legal challenges that some of these security implications and some of the solutions might pose, because that, of course, is very important. Now, this rise of social media as a tool, and what we talk about when we talk about the Islamic State, we're often talking about digital radicalization. One of the reasons I got into comparison is because we talk about digital radicalization when we talk about the Islamic State, but we see the same thing on the extreme right, and yet we don't talk about radicalization. I'll get into that in a few minutes. The second thing is one of the pandemic was an important moment, obviously, for everyone for various reasons, but it also was a point in which we saw an explosion of propaganda and of online resources, because of course everyone was at home. And this was true, and we see this in statistics, for example, the complaints of internet crimes, the complaints as well of online radicalization, notably in the United States, if we look at the FBI statistics, but also in the UK. In the 18 months leading up to June, for example, of 2020, 17 minors in the UK were arrested for terrorism-related offenses, including some as young as 14, both online and in real life. So we see as well the link to actual crimes or terrorist attacks in real life. And so the pandemic obviously fueled radicalization on both sides. And both of these, and I look at the digital strategies, some of the sort of key differences, which I'll try and get into in a few minutes.
we can see both incredible similarities and very big differences. And of course, focusing on this question of how it affects our security, not only sort of the physical attacks, what we could call individual jihad in some of the documents that we see coming out of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, but as well coming out of the self-radicalized on the right. So the questions of this study are the following. I'm going to focus on 3 questions, and I know I have 15 minutes, so do tell me before I go. I could spend hours talking about this. The first is how they leverage social media to advance their objectives, how it affects, of course, not only our security, but our counterterrorism policies. And what are some today of the ethical and legal challenges to addressing some of this in the context both of AI, using artificial intelligence to perhaps find some of the trends, some of the tendencies, and to identify suspects, but also, of course, in the context of current policies in the United States by Musk and X, or Zuckerberg and Meta. So I guess the first thing is, how do they leverage sort of social media? A couple of different examples, of course. We could look at the Islamic State, and I won't go back over what the colleagues looked at in around 2015. But we see even today, in 2020, even without the caliphate in the current context, we see extremist videos taken from YouTube have resurfaced. They resurface on other platforms within hours. Stanford recently came out with a study on that as well in the last couple of years. We see radicalization, this rise of what I don't like to call lone wolf attacks, but what some people do call lone wolf attacks. In any case, individuals and not groups. This idea that they no longer need central command structures is very important. This propaganda that we're seeing is allowing those who are self-radicalized online to inspire themselves with online content, and sometimes to inspire others. We see this, of course, in the murder of Samuel Paty in France, but we also see this in the United States in a number of extreme right cases. And in perhaps we can look at the January 6th attack in the United States, extremists, right-wing extremists, using propaganda, using these tools to coordinate attacks as well as to spread and inspire more violence. So one of the things one of the challenges that we have to this is, of course, the global regulations. And one of the sort of keys to this is the future of counterterrorism in the global age. Looking at the sort of political and regulatory landscape is obviously going to be very important. So unlike my colleagues, I'm not looking at bricolage, but I am looking at one of the big questions that I look at, particularly in this case of terrorism, that is particularly important in the United States, but not only, is the question of how we define not only terrorism, but how we define things like cyber radicalization and so forth. And one of the problems that we see, obviously, is that a public problem doesn't exist objectively. It's a social construction. And often it is a product of policymakers that have something in mind in particular. This is particularly true in the United States, where we have a very vague notion of radicalization that is very tuned towards things like the Islamic State, whereas we know today that that's not necessarily the main threat in the United States, and that we see the same trends in terms of radicalization online. So the concept of digital propaganda, if we look at the definition of propaganda, which Laswell describes as the management of collective attitudes through manipulation of significant symbols, we see social media modernizing this concept by automating propaganda, notably today through these algorithms or the AI-driven recommendation systems. If we look at sort of the different examples on the right and in terms of jihadists, and I forgot to put my table up here, so I apologize. But if we look in terms of recruiting, for example, on the one hand, we have jihadist groups looking at encrypted messaging and direct outreach. On the other hand, far-right extremists using a sort of conspiracy theory forums, looking at a sort of viral meme culture, both of them using Telegram, for example, quite a bit. We see narrative framing, which the colleagues talked about quite a bit before. We see an anti-Western narrative, of course, and religious grievances in the jihadist movements. And then, of course, conspiracy theory, anti-government terrorism, and anti-immigration on the far right, whether it be QAnon or white supremacists, notably in the United States. In both cases, one of the things that we see is, of course, attack inspiration. If we have the propaganda, and certainly the propaganda that the colleagues looked at, particularly if we look at al-Nabaa today or Inspire, for example, with Al-Qaeda, playbooks allowing them to inspire themselves even if they're sitting in their living room or in their mom's garage. But we see the same thing today on the extreme right. If we look, for example, in Christchurch in 2019, if we look at other examples since then, Christchurch was the attack on the mosque by Tarrant. We see manifestos, and these manifestos do the exact same thing. They're less well-designed and certainly less digitally neat than the ISIS groups. But what we do see is we see the exact same trends. So self-radicalized individuals inspired by manifestos, very clear online in different forums, sometimes in the same, particularly in Telegram. And then, of course, in terms of propaganda strategy, high production videos, 5 minutes, okay. On the part of the Islamic State, magazine publications like Dabiq, like Al-Nabaa today, with also, and I would add, in addition to the formal media agencies, of course, all of the sort of fanboy groups that also do their own media. On the right, and the extreme right, of course, social media virality, a lot of meme-driven mobilization. If we look at two case studies, the Christchurch and the Paris attacks are very good examples. In 2019, not only was it live streamed on Facebook, so a really clear, immediate use of online platforms, but it was directly inspired by far-right internet platforms and forums like 8chan. The 2015 attacks in Paris, of course, we know that there was coordination via Telegram, and we can see the jihadist use of encrypted apps for logistics. So, because I know I don't have a lot more time, to understand the methodology, I've been doing this, I started with the period that the colleagues looked at, and I've been doing this for 10 years and started looking, because I saw very similar trends, of course, at what the extreme right is doing. And so it's a lot of Telegram groups, and we see as well an adaptive behavior, looking at, for example, on the extreme right, Gab, other encrypted apps, Rocket Chat, and others for, of course, the jihadists. And, of course, a lot of online campaigns as well. Really quickly, just some of the results. The increased reach of extremist ideologies, particularly post-COVID, towards young people in particular, and I won't go into that here because I don't have the time, but sort of an age, the age is lowering. We're getting them being able to reach 12, 14-year-olds, and that's becoming a huge trend. And it's making, whether it be the technology and making counterterrorism efforts harder, since I'm definitely, I know, late, but one of the things that is very important that is to be able to try and use technology to combat this, including the use of AI to establish trends. It is a problem in France in particular with legal limits, and this balance between security and, of course, civil liberties is going to be one of the biggest problems that we have with this type of threat. But I know that I have to stop, so I will end here because otherwise I could go on for hours on this question, a legal question. I still have 2 minutes. So the legal question I think is very important. One of the things that we see, and we saw this notably for events as well that are threatened by this type of ideology, can we use, for example, AI, and can we use facial recognition, for example? This type of technology can also be used online because we have tendencies and trends that we can define, whether they be right-wing extremists or the Islamic State or jihadists. The problem is today is to find that balance between civil liberties, and of course also, because this goes way beyond the borders, also having to work in cooperation with other countries, notably the United States, and as we know, unfortunately today, that may be much more complicated than we think.
regarding third-party fact-checking, and you basically the community notes model, so lifting restrictions by saying we will allow more free speech on some mainstream topics that would allow discourse, etc. So can you please provide us with
So yeah, one of the things that we're seeing in the United States, and this is important because a lot of particularly whether we're talking about X or we're talking about Meta, as you pointed out, are based in the United States. So just a reminder that the American Constitution protects free speech and that the Americans have a very radical vision of free speech compared to us Europeans. And certainly the law is a reflection of that. One of the things that we see today is when the fact-checking and when all of those sort of community sort of norms came into play, remember that it wasn't the way we have laws, it was also each of these institutions, whether they're companies, agreeing to do the job. In Europe, they have to do the job because we make them do the job, but at least in the United States, sort of agreeing to do the job. That had as an effect all of these groups moving, sort of going to other platforms. You have a lot of other platforms today, notably Telegram, obviously, and that's one of the biggest ones. But if we look at Gab for the extreme right, you have other platforms where they've been on now since there have been limits on Facebook and on Twitter. What we can imagine, and talking with colleagues, particularly legal colleagues on this, is the lifting of these restrictions may allow them to, of course, reinvest these these spaces, giving them obviously more reach, and that's particularly true. And if you look at the extreme right, that's particularly true. We've seen them sort of reinvest, whether it be X or other spaces. To a large extent, Facebook's become sort of, probably also for generational reasons, less used by these groups, not only because of the sort of free speech restrictions.
Yes? No? Okay.
Thank you very much for that. That was wonderful. I wondered, as an academic, what your opinion was on how advanced the study of this might be in the West compared to how governments, for example, in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, who have very advanced mechanisms for tracking this kind of thing, and if they're actually far ahead in understanding this because of the threat to their security. And the Arabic language element.
So the Arabic language element, the language element more generally, and in the Middle East, the Israelis as well have huge, I mean, I work with them as well, for two reasons, and I work a lot on counterterrorism in Israel compared to the West. You have the language and the cultural aspects, and there are aspects that we don't necessarily study enough of. You also have the legal aspects. Why those governments may indeed have a step on us. It's very simple. In Israel, you can use, for example, and I've talked to other experts, I think of Mohammed Sifawi in particular when I think about this, because we've had this discussion. If you create a software to go in, and we know how a lot of these groups act, and we can identify it online using big data, using artificial intelligence, but we're not allowed to. If you go with that software to someone here, they'll say, that's not legal. If you go to someone in the Middle East, whether it be Israel, Jordan, the UAE, they'll say, wonderful, how can we use that to prevent? We're in reaction to a very large extent, whereas they're much more into prevention. And we have statistics, and I think there's even a RAND study on it, how many attacks in Israel have been prevented just by AI and big data and analysis of online behavior that allows us to catch people before they act. Obviously, we can't do the same thing. So yes, they know it better, but they also can act in a very different way because they don't have the same constraints.
Thank you.
Thank you. A question? Yeah.
A short question. Please elaborate on why the pandemic has shown a rise in audience. Is it just because people had more time to spend home, or?
Two things. So yes, everyone was behind their computer and at home, particularly young people, and they couldn't recruit in the same way or incite attacks in the same way. Remember, we were all in lockdown for most of the world, so it became very interesting. They even, in both cases, used it to their advantage. You have propaganda for the Islamic State calling coronavirus the soldier of Allah, for example, and inciting attacks, go and cough on people or go into a hospital and cause an attack. And on the right, you had as well attacks that were on immigration, that were on Jews, for the exact same thing. It was, for both cases, something that allowed them to, because everyone was online, but also because everyone was online and you couldn't inspire attacks. Running through a crowd like ISIS and Al-Qaeda has suggested as an attack in a car in lockdown doesn't make a lot of sense. So it caused them to adapt as well. And we did, and one of the things that I'll say is we see a spike in young people and youth recruitment from the pandemic on, probably because people were at home quite a bit.
Thank you for the answers, questions, and for the presentation. Very interesting. And now the last presentation will be made by Juliette Freddy, Cécile Godet, and Philippe Lépinard. And the title of the presentation is in French, but your talk is in English, right? In French? Ah, okay.
One part in English and one part in French.
Ah, part in English.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
La pleine conscience technologique en soutien à la prise de décision en contexte extrême. Alors, je ne sais pas dire la pleine conscience, donc je vais vous laisser traduire. Mindfulness. Ah, yes, of course. So, technological mindfulness in... comment on dit soutien? Support to decision making in extreme context.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Philippe Lépinard, Associate Professor in Information System Management at IAE Paris-Est, the business school of UPEC, Université Paris-Est Créteil. I am also the co-supervisor of Juliette Freddy.
For the presentation, I will talk in English. So I'm Juliette Freddy. I am a PhD candidate at CERGAM, Aix-Marseille University, and I'm currently working at MBDA, France. And my work is about IT mindfulness and decision making in extreme context. And I hold a master's degree in cybersecurity with Mr. Lépinard formation.
Thank you, Juliette. First of all, I would like to apologize for my limited English. I have my notes to speak slowly and clearly, I hope. We would like to thank the organizational team for their support. And moreover, we are particularly honored with Mr. Thatcher's presence because your work, Mrs. Thatcher's, is the starting point of ours. So, during my other life, because I was an helicopter pilot in the French Army Air Corps during 20 years, I did a thesis on the digitalization of the battlefield for the helicopters. And after this first work, we, with my colleagues, not Juliette this time, we work about wargaming, analytical wargaming, and structural pedagogical wargaming. And there was last year the renewal of wargaming with notably the creation of the first French association in wargaming. So with Juliette, we are going to we worked about a new method of wargaming that we will present you later. As Juliette said to you, she has the opportunity to integrate MBDA to do her thesis. In France, sorry, this is a CIFRE thesis. A CIFRE thesis is a thesis in a society and supporting by the French Ministry of Defense.
Alors, je démarre avec la problématique. Donc, qui anime ma réflexion, c'est comment la pleine conscience technologique influence-t-elle le processus donc, de prise de décision de l'expert en contexte extrême. Justement, pour répondre à cette problématique, on peut passer à la slide suivante pour le cadre théorique. On a un cadre théorique qui se scinde en 3 parties distinctes, avec donc tout d'abord la pleine conscience technologique, en anglais IT Mindfulness, qui est un concept qui a été développé et théorisé par Thatcher et ses co-auteurs en 2018, et qui en fait s'intéresse aux interactions avec les technologies. Il traduit l'intentionnalité de l'acteur envers la technologie plutôt qu'un état passif. Et la particularité de ce cadre théorique, c'est qu'on peut aborder des questions qui vont être à la fois donc duales, donc à la fois militaires et civiles. Et il nous intéresse particulièrement parce que, justement, ça offre une opportunité d'analyser des phénomènes en système d'information dans la gestion des technologies. Et ce concept, on le combine donc avec la décision naturaliste, alors, qui est un concept très connu qui se développe justement à la fin des années 80, suite à un événement dans le Golfe Persique. Le 3 juillet 1988, on a l'USS Vincennes qui abat un avion de ligne iranien suite à une mauvaise compréhension de la situation. En fait, ils abattent cet avion parce qu'ils pensent qu'au-dessus d'eux, ils ont un F-14, alors qu'en réalité, donc, ils ont cet avion civil avec 290 personnes à bord. Donc ce courant en fait, de la décision naturaliste, ça a mis en évidence que les différents experts en fait, s'appuient à la fois sur leurs expériences et sur leur intuition pour prendre des décisions. Donc en fait, le contexte doit être intégré à l'analyse de l'environnement. Donc ce concept de la décision naturaliste, la personne qui est à l'origine, c'est Gary Klein. On retrouve de nombreux travaux sur ce concept. Nous, justement, on l'utilise pour comprendre comment les experts prennent des décisions dans ces contextes extrêmes. Et le contexte extrême, lui, se caractérise par 3 éléments très importants, donc un haut niveau donc, de risque, d'incertitude et de changement. Et en quoi ça nous intéresse ? En fait, parce qu'un contexte extrême, ça révèle bien souvent des pratiques qui sont indiscernables en situation standard. On va avoir des pratiques, des comportements bien différents, et c'est en ça que ça peut être intéressant de mobiliser donc à la fois la pleine conscience technologique, le contexte extrême et la décision naturaliste. Je reviens 2 minutes sur la décision naturaliste parce que j'ai oublié de dire quelque chose de très important. C'est le modèle RPD, Recognition Prime Decision. Ce modèle, donc, il a été développé par Gary Klein et il met vraiment en évidence que chaque décideur va passer par différentes étapes lors de sa réflexion et qu'il s'appuie vraiment donc, sur différents signaux, qu'il va les interpréter, il va trouver une correspondance et c'est ça qui va le guider à la séquence d'action qu'il va réaliser ensuite dans la réalité. Donc voilà pour ce champ théorique. Ça, c'est votre tour.
Thank you, Juliette. So to answer the question, research question, sorry, we imagined a new research method, a qualitative research method, which is detailed to an article in the blog on wargaming PACSIMS. If you flash the QR code, you go to directly to this article on the website. So this new methodology advances 3 elements. First of all, war games. The second is Lego serious play, the method Lego serious play for the reflexive phases. And the third element is the cooperative inquiry from Iran. This is research action methodology, qualitative research action.
Au niveau des contributions attendues par cette thèse, donc on a des contributions à 3 niveaux. Et c'est en ça que cette thèse elle est assez originale. Donc d'abord, au niveau théorique, nous, ce qu'on voudrait essayer de faire, justement, c'est de modéliser donc, comment l'IT Mindfulness en fait, enrichit le processus de décision des experts dans des contextes extrêmes. On veut vraiment réussir à modéliser ça. Donc c'est un vrai travail. On travaille donc avec le terrain, donc les opérateurs militaires, essentiellement ceux qui utilisent donc des systèmes de missiles ou des technologies émergentes. Ensuite, donc au niveau managérial, il s'agit vraiment de comprendre ce que font les acteurs sur le terrain. On revient sur la décision naturaliste et on étudie ce qu'ils font, on n'étudie pas ce qu'ils devraient faire.
Donc l'idée, c'est ça, c'est sur les aspects managériels, c'est de comprendre les processus décisionnels à l'œuvre. Et enfin, comme le présentait Monsieur Lépinard, sur la partie plutôt méthodologie, on a une approche qui est singulière, qu'on essaie de rendre la plus robuste d'ailleurs possible. Et en fait, cette approche, elle n'a encore jamais été vue au niveau international. Et ça va permettre donc d'avoir une thèse assez singulière avec des contributions à différents niveaux. Alors pour conclure sur cette présentation, on va préciser plusieurs éléments. Donc déjà, la thèse, elle a démarré il y a 5 mois. Elle a démarré en octobre 2024. Donc elle est censée durer 3 ans, puisque dans le cadre des CIFRE défense, donc c'est vraiment, il faut respecter les 3 ans. Et on a donc des réflexions en cours à 2 niveaux. Donc déjà sur la contextualisation du sujet. On était parti sur l'intelligence artificielle, en fait. Et finalement, on va peut-être bouger plutôt vers les technologies émergentes parce qu'elles ont le mérite d'englober l'intelligence artificielle, qu'elle soit symbolique ou connexionniste. Donc, a priori, on partirait plutôt sur ça. Et également, on a quelque chose qu'on doit clarifier, qu'on aura d'ailleurs peut-être l'occasion de clarifier avec Monsieur Thatcher, qui est donc le niveau, en fait, sur lequel on va se situer. Est-ce qu'on est plutôt au niveau individuel ou au niveau organisationnel ? Et enfin, pour revenir sur cette méthodologie, on est donc sur une approche assez originale et singulière. On essaie de la construire, c'est un travail qui prend du temps, mais on est fiers de pouvoir développer ce type de méthodologie dans le cadre d'un projet de thèse. Et on vous remercie pour votre attention. On a mis toutes les références de la présentation. Merci beaucoup.
Merci. Questions? I understand we have experts in IT mindfulness here. So maybe I have a questions, because indeed we have experts in IT mindfulness, but we are not all experts in IT mindfulness. And actually, I do need a conceptual definition of IT mindfulness. If you have one.
La définition de l'IT mindfulness.
Oui, to better understand what you are looking after.
Dynamic IT evidence when working with IT. Maybe you could say perfect definition.
C'est trop facile.
So it's awareness of change in the context, opportunities that can be realized. It's creating new content categories for doing new things. There's one more dimension, but it's
It will come back later. Okay, thank you for the definition. And I think we have questions here in the back.
So first of all, congrats. Very, very good to hear you and know that you are deepening the wargaming scene, because this is a pretty not the use of wargaming, but the scene within our universities, which is pretty much developed on the last years. And I was thinking about, because regarding the studies, they are divided into the didactical ones, which are in terms of serious games dedicated to doctrine development, policy testing, and so on. And those that are much more connected to scenario building or analysis, content analysis. In this regard, some scholars, like within the wargaming scene, there is an MIT network, and I can for sure add you to some of those networks. But we are very much focused on the way we can uphold behavior in terms of institutional behavior, and how we can add the practitioners' experiences and permitting this to be a double-way road in terms of not only having from a top-bottom approach in which strategic thinking can uphold knowledge and processes, but through wargaming, how practitioners could add in terms of their own behavior, and how could analysis about this behavior could add. Would you think about the interference of these knowledge that you have been working with, such as IT mindfulness, regarding behavior and institutional behavior. Could you add some thoughts on this? Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much for your
not
comments.
using
Now we experimented our methodology with wargaming, not only on the research question. Because this is the beginning of the research, we would like to test the methodology in terms of technical. We thought about okay. Or maybe I could pursue for all, but we worked on logistical aspects of this methodological analytical wargaming. So we don't link the research question with the method because we must try before the method. So we are here now. We tested last week with 15 students in master degree the method before deploying it for the real question. The article you could read is on this first test to try the third element and the third element combination.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. Another question? Yes, of course.
I was wondering, because you talked a lot about many complex concepts. I personally don't know the definitions of all of these concepts, but it seems like a very complicated picture that you painted. And I was wondering what your hunch is about the manner in which decision makers make their decisions at this point in time. What do you think?
Henches. We don't know what is henches. Sorry. Hench. Intuition. Non, l'intuition dans la prise de décision. Yes. No, it's interesting, but we are not at this point for now. Yes, we couldn't answer now at this question, but this is one type of decision, intuition. So we must see it during the deployment of the method, but this is not the subject for us now.
Okay.
Sorry.
Et peut-être, je vais me permettre pour terminer une question, l'utilisation de jeux sérieux pour explorer en fait et expérimenter des théories, des hypothèses, permet certainement d'aboutir à des observations, tirer des conclusions. Toutefois, à quel point est-ce que ces jeux sérieux sont fiables et à quel point en fait est-ce qu'ils doivent être réalistes pour que ces conclusions qu'on tire puissent être généralisées au champ qu'on essaye en fait d'étudier lui-même. Est-ce que dans un jeu sérieux, on est dans des conditions extrêmes et surtout est-ce qu'on est dans les conditions extrêmes qu'en réalité on aurait souhaité étudier?
Thank you very much for your answer. You could go to the EduTeam research project. EduTeam is a project on game-oriented learning where we work about that. Wargames is not serious games. The wargame we use is to simulate as a simulator. So when I was a pilot, I learned to fly in a flight simulator, but not realistic, not full mission simulator. I learned some elements in a Microsoft Flight Simulator. This is a game. And the difference between a game or a serious game and what we do is a rigorous methodology. We integrate before and after doing the 3 alpha, debriefing to do that, right. So it's not a game alone, it's an entire methodology to support rigorous.
Thank you very much, and thank you for everybody for your questions. And I think that's it.
Thank you very much.
And that was the 3 presentations of the session. So have a nice rest of the day. Thank you.